morning. I'm Diane Jordan, Director of Christian Education with Pleasant Hill United Methodist Church, located in Indian Land, South Carolina. Today is Sunday, September 13th in the year 2020, and thank you for joining me this morning for our adult Sunday school lesson. Now, typically in the life of the church, this Sunday is Promotion Sunday. It's also the Sunday we begin a new Sunday school curriculum for the children. So I decided we would do that as well with our adult studies that I videotape for you each week. So instead of pulling out a verse of the Bible or a story of the Bible, I'm going to be pulling out the stories of a person and talking specifically about the people whose lives are recorded in our Bible. I'll be doing this all the way up until the season of Advent begins. So thank you for joining me, and let's get started. Before I start, we're going to talk today a little bit about the land of Egypt. And I wanted to show you a map of Egypt during the time of the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy. You can see here, one very interesting thing about the Nile River is it has all these fingers that come out, and it looks like a lotus flower, with this being the top of the flower and this being the stalk. And thanks to my friends at Lifeway.com, I learned that the Egyptians used the lotus flower in the decorations of their buildings, their pottery and such, more than any other symbol. And the reason for that is very simple. The Nile River is a river that flows from the south to the north. It's very unusual, and it's a very long river. It's over 4,000 miles long. And so this river flows up to Egypt, and 3 months out of every year, this river would overflow onto the land. And what that did was drop off tons of nutrients for the plants that they were growing, and it became a very fertile area. This allowed them to grow wheat and barley and flax and to have cattle. And what's interesting is all these nutrients that would wash up out of the Nile River actually turned the sand or the soil black. That's a big contrast from the red desert sands that are when you get a little further away from the river's edge. And so the Egyptians become very wealthy. They become a great military power. And into this, we're going to start today our story of Moses. And Moses is someone that we all know. He's someone that we learn about from the time we're very, very young because he's so important in our Bibles. Moses was born during the New Kingdom period when Egypt was a powerful international empire and Pharaoh was its supreme ruler. And something very interesting to note about the Pharaoh, he believed that he was God himself. And that's what the Egyptians were taught. He was believed to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and we know he's not. He's just a human like anyone else. But that was the perception that he presented for the people. So during this time, a man from Levi's household marries a Levite woman, and that man and woman happened to be the son of Amram and Jochebed, who were descendants of Jacob through Jacob's son Levi, who grew up to lead Hebrew slaves out of Egyptian slavery. And those are Moses' parents. Moses' parents give birth to him during a time when the Pharaoh has decreed that the oldest child, the oldest male son, will be executed. And so Moses is hidden in his parents' home until he's 3 months old. And all of us that have had children know how incredibly difficult that must have been and stressful to keep a newborn infant from crying and from being heard by the others in the community. So for 3 months, to protect himself from the Pharaoh's proclamation, his mother conceals him in his house. And then she goes down to the river's edge, the Nile's river's edge. And there's aquatic vegetation that grows on the side of the Nile River. And his mother places him in a basket made of reed and puts him in the river. She also has his sister linger to watch and see what happens to her precious son. So tradition says that the Egyptian princess comes down to the river to bathe, and she was childless, which, as we know from our studies, during biblical times, a woman that was childless was almost looked down upon by the community. She was definitely pitied. And so the Egyptian princess goes down to bathe, and her attendant slaves follow her. And she sees a basket over in the side in the vegetation, and she sends them over to get the basket. When they bring the basket up on shore and it's opened, the baby inside cries. And she is moved to compassion. She's determined that she will raise this child as her own child. And the sister, seeing what's happening, recommends a Hebrew nurse to the princess. And that Hebrew nurse is Moses' own mother, his own birth mother. And so for the first 3 or so years, because they at that time nursed their babies for 3 years, Moses is raised in the home of his parents. He's with his parents. And what's amazing to that is that gives him the foundation for the faith and the knowledge of God that is going to make him the man that he is going to be. So the first 40 years or so of Moses' life. Moses is interesting because he lived 120 years, and you can divide his life into 40-year segments. The first segment of his life is his education, and he lives in the Egyptian surroundings. He lives with the Pharaoh. He spends most of his days playing as a young boy, and at age 10, he starts his formal education. And at that time, that would have been reading and writing, and then archery, rowing, horsemanship, maybe basic military training and such. When he's about 14, he sort of chooses his career path and decides if he's going to be a military or a government, or if he's going to be in the priesthood. And he begins training for that as well. By the time he's 20, Moses has completed his formal education. And at this age, Egyptian culture would have dictated he takes an Egyptian wife. He would have been assigned some job in the administrative task in the household, or a minor office in local or provincial government. And when he's almost 40, it takes him out to see the Hebrews. And at this part begins the second 40 years of his life. He sees the sufferings of his people, and he's determined to go to them as their helper. And in an instant, he makes a choice that is life-changing, not only for him, but for his people. Seeing an Israelite suffering a beating from an Egyptian and thinking that they are alone, he kills the Egyptian and buries the corpse in the sand. However, it becomes known that he has slayed the Egyptian, and he has to flee to the land of Midian. And when he flees, he marries Zipporah, the daughter of his host. For 40 years, Moses communes with God and with nature. He escapes from the false ideas and teachings that he had learned in Egypt, and he learns to sift out the truths about God. This is the process of his training for the work that is to come. So, this process is completed when God meets him, appearing in a burning bush and communicating with him and appointing him to be the leader and deliverer of his people. Moses is being asked to go above and beyond what he thinks he can do. And God identifies himself as the I Am. So Moses agrees, after discussion, to be God's messenger, and he follows God's directions. And Moses and Aaron do exactly what they're told. They go to Pharaoh, and they tell Pharaoh to release their people. And of course, Pharaoh refuses to listen to Moses. And an interesting thing is that at this time period, the Egyptians did not even consider the Israelites to be people. They were things. They were slaves. They were not considered to be people. And so the miraculous plagues began. The water in the Nile turns to blood, and then frogs, gnats, and flies overrun the land. One plague causes the death of livestock. Another brings boils, and yet another brings deadly hail. Another plague brings a swarm of locusts, and then a plague of darkness that covers Egypt. Moses announces each plague, and each arrives and departs exactly as he tells Pharaoh it's going to happen. And as the plagues progress, they are more and more devastating. Several times Pharaoh agrees to let the people go, but when the devastation stops, he refuses to let them leave. He goes back on his word. The plagues punish Egypt, but they also show Pharaoh that he is not in control. His gods are not in control, and it demonstrates God's sovereignty over all. So think about it for a moment. In his early life, Moses lived in the palace and he didn't want or need anything. In the middle of his life, he lives humbly as a shepherd in the desert, and he communes with nature. And now he's back in the house of Pharaoh, the house that he grew up in. And this time he is an instrument of God, performing God's signs and wonders and telling the Pharaoh what to do. Quite a story. So Moses leads the people out of Egypt after the 10th plague, which is the death of the firstborn. And what's interesting in this plague is that the Israelites protect themselves from this plague by marking their doors. And so just as they're all ready to breathe a sigh of relief, they are on their way. They are going to the promised land. They see behind them the Pharaoh has sent his army to retrieve them. God tells Moses to lift his staff and stretch it out over the Red Sea. God would divide the sea so the Israelites could go through the sea on dry ground. And Israel goes through that parted Red Sea. When Moses is there, he's the one holding the staff. He has no claim on Israel's deliverance because God is working through him. But he holds up his staff. He parts the Red Sea, and he protects his people. Now, of course, the Pharaoh's army tries to follow them. And as they enter the path, the seas close and completely destroy the army. It's also interesting to note that as the Israelites were going through the Red Sea, the angel of God stood between the Israelites and the Egyptians. God sent help for them when they needed it. When the Egyptian chariots pursue the Israelites into the dry seabed, God causes them to swerve and to stall. We don't know if the wheels maybe couldn't move in that sand or whatever, but the sea completely engulfs the entire Egyptian army. And the Egyptians had been warned. They had been sent 10 plagues, and they refused to believe. And so God keeps his word. Moses has an amazing life story. He leads the people to the promised land after 40 years in the desert. But Moses himself does not enter the promised land. There is an amazing, almost his last words recorded in our Bibles that you can read as Moses stands there knowing that he can see the promised land, but he cannot enter it, and his faith never wavers. We also know that Moses receives the 10 Commandments. There's so much to learn from our Bibles about this incredible man. And this is a man that had a problem with stuttering. This is a man that maybe you wouldn't have thought God would have chosen to lead his people. But when we look at the life of Moses, we see how God can take anyone, and through his actions and his words, he can use us to spread his word and to share the good news with others. Moses can illustrate to us how God accomplishes his work through people that are just like us, people that are struggling sinners and feeble doubters, weak workers, reluctant leaders. God loves us, and he uses his people not because they are capable, but because he is capable. So again, if you've ever had a hard time when you're just not sure what to do, take it to the Lord in prayer. Think about those times when you have felt completely out of your comfort zone, and we've all had them. What fears did you have in that moment, and how did God take care of those situations for you? Also, think about Moses' response to the burning bush. When have you looked at a situation or an occurrence in your life and realized that God had sent someone in that moment to help you, to guide you, or to save you from a difficulty? Because God sends people in our lives as well. Thanks for joining me this morning. I look forward to seeing you next Sunday. Have a blessed week.